Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Every week, we bring you the stories of people who bring you ideas that find their way into action that makes the world better in some interesting way, locally, globally, and digitally. The Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley is part of Rotary International, well over 1 million Rotarians and Rotaractors in 180-something countries or something like this, 36,000 plus clubs. All people who have dedicated themselves to service above self, that opportunity to regularly meet with others who care about making the world better. It's a really good way to spend your time. And so if you are curious about to learn more about Rotary, by all means, follow the links that you see either on our YouTube page or our SiliconValleyRotary.com page. Today, we have with us Ilan Wallington, who is part of GiveDirectly. And he is going to tell us about their model for alleviating poverty. As a club, we are particularly interested in innovative and sustainable approaches to addressing the causes that are important to Rotary. And I think we've got a good one waiting for us with Ilan's presentation. Ilan, I hand the mic over to you. Welcome to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. I'll share my screen here. But again, my name's Ilan. I'm excited to get to speak with you all today. You have a great setup here, being able to hear from different innovative companies and leaders across different industries. And like you said, I'm going to be here to talk about GiveDirectly and how we've spent the last decade disrupting the aid sector, a sector that's been a little slower in innovating. And so GiveDirectly is about as simple as its name. We take cash from donors and we give it directly to people. We're one of the fastest growing international NGOs and the market leaders in delivering cash to the extreme poor. And when we talk about people in extreme poverty, we're talking about people living on less than $2.15 a day. So to let that sink in, just meaning pretty much an inhumane deprivation of basic human needs. So that could be safe food, maybe only having one meal a day. It could mean lack of safe drinking water or having to walk miles to find some proper sanitation facilities or shelter, no money for education, you name it. And so beyond those basic facts, part of my motivation to work at GiveDirectly actually came from something similar to this chart. So if you see here, in the most literal sense, we have more than enough resources to close the poverty gap in our lifetime. Brookings Institute estimated $100 million was what's needed to close the poverty gap. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals, this is the first Sustainable Development Goal, is to get rid of extreme poverty by 2030. And yet we are not on track to do so. And in fact, we're quite far from it. Experts say that over 500 million people will still be in extreme poverty by 2030. And this has not only been made worse by COVID, conflict, and climate change, but it also begs the question of why haven't we done it? Why have traditional aid models largely failed to address poverty, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa? And I'll start answering that first by what I think is, it's impossible to know what every person in extreme poverty needs. You can't group people together. Everyone has different needs and wants something different. But I think secondly, much of the money in the aid sector historically has been spent on things that are simply not helping as much as we had thought. Expensive training programs, sending in-kind donations like clothes, rice, are just not making fast enough progress towards these goals. And like I'll show today, we know cash works, and yet only about 2% of foreign aid currently is being spent in the form of cash transfers. And so for decades, experts from completely different parts of the world are looking at these remote places of extreme poverty and have decided what recipients need. I think they need a school. I think they need a cow. I think their bike needs to be repaired. But part of the problem is that we've sort of overcomplicated how we give. If I'm a donor and I want to send money, a lot of your money can get consumed in overhead costs, in shipping costs of materials. And often individuals who are receiving in-kind donations will sell those in order to get cash to get whatever they actually need. But I think the bigger question to sort of pose here is, why are donors and large government agencies deciding what we give? And more importantly, what people in extreme poverty need? And I think this is really where GiveDirectly comes in. So we let donors send money directly to the world's poorest households in the form of unconditional cash, meaning no strings attached cash. We're firm believers that people living in extreme poverty deserve the dignity to choose for themselves how best to improve their lives, and think cash is really an enabler of that choice. And luckily, there's been a huge revolution, primarily across Africa, when it comes to mobile phone adoption. Even in some of the most remote and poor places in the world, you'll see really high uptakes in people with mobile phones and access to mobile phones. And what that means is access to mobile money. And so for context, when GiveDirectly first started about a decade ago, our founders literally were flying to Kenya to refugee camps, handing out cash to people individually. And I think you can imagine if you're thinking about sustainable solutions, flying to places and giving out cash is not exactly sustainable. And luckily, mobile money is about as scalable as it gets when it comes to, the development toolkit. And for those maybe wondering, well, what if someone doesn't have a phone? In addition to the cash, we also give them a phone. And so the next sort of revolution, and I'll let you read some of the stats on the slide here, but is the increasing popularity of randomized control trials in the aid sector. And so similar to a medical trial, a randomized control trial is comparing a control group to a treatment group to really put to the test what interventions are working and what are not. And so cash happens to be among the most studied aid interventions in existence. There's over 300 rigorous studies, and I can send links to our website that shows not just GiveDirectly studies, but all studies on cash as well. But these are showing time and time again how folks are not spending the money on booze or quitting their jobs because they're now lazy because they have money. And I think part of why cash is studied so much is because there is a real psychological barrier to trust people to choose best how to transform their own lives. We've run about 20 randomized control studies, which you can see some of the results here on inflation, comparing it to other interventions. And we are also conducting the world's largest and longest UBI study in history, so universal basic income, which you may be familiar with in Kenya. And so to make it a bit more real for a second, I'd like to take two examples just from Uganda and Malawi, two people who were recipients of GiveDirectly cash transfers. And I think part of the beauty of cash is just how multidimensional it is. So taking Clovia, for example, she was dealing with a leaking roof, something we see often with people living in extreme poverty. She was pretty humiliated having to send her children really long distances just to use the bathroom that was safe enough to avoid her kids getting sick from rainwater or bugs on the ground. And she used her money to not only restore her latrine, but to buy a house with iron sheets to protect from the rain. She also bought a goat that she was hoping will bring in recurring income as the flock grows. And so this is something we actually see quite often is people investing in sustainable forms of cash coming in the door. So you're not just relying on the cash that comes in from GiveDirectly. Whereas we have Bertha, on the other hand, who paid for a pretty life-changing surgery for her son to be able to walk again. And I think just taking a moment to say, we're not here to build a hospital. We're here to help the folks who can't even afford to pay for hospital bills, or in some cases, people who can't even afford to get to a hospital because transportation costs are too high. And luckily, her son's surgery was a huge success. But you can see from the chart on the left, just the multitude of ways folks are using cash when it comes in the door. And it's pretty remarkable to see. And so we've sort of proven time and time again that people are not wasting money, not getting lazy, and just live in pretty unspeakable conditions and do pretty remarkable things when given the chance to change their lives. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we actually work as an organization. And I'll try to keep it as simple as possible here and breaking it down into the sort of 4 key steps for GiveDirectly. So the first thing we do is find the people that we're going to be supporting. And we have many different ways of doing so. It's a combination of government census data. We'll also use, since we transfer using mobile money, we'll use databases from telco providers. But largely what we do is in-person data collection from our staff on the ground. The majority of GiveDirectly staff work in the places that we deliver money to, and the majority of those people are from those places. And we've seen also a lot of this process increase in speeds of up to 6 times with the help of machine learning and AI, helping us use aerial imagery as well to identify those people most in need. If it's looking at, thatched roofs of housing or before a disaster strikes, et cetera. The next step in the process is enrollment. And so we have a few different ways we find where we work, like I said, but then when we go village by village enrolling staff, we host community meetings called barazas to let them know what's to come. And this is not to tell them how to spend their money. This is just to inform them of what's happening. Here you can see a photo from our Liberia team, the enrollment team in River Kes. It's a remote area of southeastern Liberia. It took the team boat rides, hours of walking and crossing creeks to reach some of the most vulnerable people that we're working with in some of the most remote places in the world. After enrolling eligible participants, then we deliver the funds to recipients through mobile phones. So the fun part here. In some cases, we're giving people also their first ever national ID, since you need one of those to get a bank account. And so those will typically come in the form of around $1,000, but that range can vary depending on the place in the program that we're working in. Lastly, we make sure to monitor how things are going. So we'll provide a hotline for folks and digital follow-up surveys. Again, this isn't to influence what the money is spent on, but rather to provide opportunity for folks to share any issues or questions that come up. And separately, we have our own internal audit team that's completely anonymous to our field staff, our sort of CIA agents who come in to prevent fraud, ensure smooth transactions, and also just check in on the families. And so their identities are completely left anonymous from staff to avoid collusion there. And so, like I said before, I think part of the beauty of cash is sort of the unpredictability of how it's spent. So I'll share some links to videos later on that show a different range of stories of how folks are using cash, because I think that's a better way to show it than to hear me talk about it. But if you're curious about ways that you can help, I think broken down pretty simply is one is to give directly. And I think this is something that, like mentioned before, we had our senior advisor, Rory Stewart, come in when he first started to Give Directly, ask people, when you give money to your families for the holidays, do you all give cash or do you give gifts? And at an organization where everyone works on cash transfers, everyone said they give gifts, kind of embarrassingly. And it's because there's a lot of pride in the gifts you're giving to your family. But I think we're talking about a completely different scenario in a completely different part of the world where what people really need is the autonomy and dignity to choose how to best transform their lives. If you're not looking to donate, there's other ways you can definitely help, helping us spread the word on cash. It's definitely gotten more popularity over the years, but we're still looking to change folks' minds on best ways to be giving. And then connecting us to friends or colleagues. My email is going to be available for folks after the call if they ever want to connect or talk more about this. And with that, I will pause here if folks have questions. And again, I just want to thank all of you for giving me the time to speak to you all, because it's a very cool organization you all have here, and I'm glad to share a little bit more about mine.
Fantastic, Elon. Thank you. So in looking at this, there's a bunch of questions I know I've written down. I'm sure like our team has plenty as well. I want to introduce the people that we have on the recording. When I call your name, please wave your hand. Joining us from here in the San Francisco Bay Area is Susan Lundy. Susan, good to see you. The Club Paella Master, Shags Shagrin. Good to see you, Shags. Nicely done. All right. And from Johannesburg, South Africa, Sviatko Shidorov. All right. Past president. Thank you, Sviatko, for joining us. My name is Rushton Hurley. I'm the program's chair, and I am excited about any program that allows us to really kind of move in the direction of some powerful questions. We're going to start with Sviatko. Go ahead and unmute and ask.
Thank you. Thanks, Rushton. Great presentation. And thank you for all that you and your organization do. I've been a huge fan of GiveDirectly for a while. It's really cool to kind of follow how you guys have grown and the excitement that the organization has generated. Quick question. In terms of the timeline of your intervention, how long does it normally last? And can you speak a little bit to how you define success? So you mentioned a few of the stories, but what is it really that kind of defines success for you after the intervention? And do you continue to monitor these communities after that stint?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really appreciate the support over the years. So to your question on what is success, I think there's both the qualitative and quantitative answers. I think for our field staff on the ground, they're seeing the more qualitative side of, the initial excitement of receiving a life-changing amount of money, potentially 2 years of salary come through the door. On the quantitative side, part of why we run these 20 randomized control trials is to prove exactly that, show what success looks like in addition to just the stories that we share. And GiveDirectly shares unfiltered, unedited stories through what we call GD Live on our website. So at any point, you can look through what recipients are saying about their cash transfers. They're not edited by our staff. They're fully unedited stories. But on the quantitative side, back to my point on the randomized control trials, we're measuring a ton of different things. And each study measures a bunch of different factors. But there's a sort of like economic side where it's like we'll see increases in consumption or assets. We'll see in Kenya, we saw a 2.5 multiplier effect in the local economy. So for every $1 that was invested, we saw a $2.50 return. We've also done studies comparing it directly to other interventions. And so it outperformed job training, nutrition programs, and an aspirations workshop. And then we'll also see folks who are investing in recurring businesses. So we'll see their incomes increase, like I said. One of the things people typically ask about is inflation. And so one of our studies ties directly to that of showing how it did not typically lead to inflation. And so a 15% GDP influx caused minimal inflation, even in super remote, poorly connected areas. And so I guess to sum up your question, part of the like multidimensionality of cash shows like multidimensional positive effects as well. And I guess, sorry, to your last point as well on the timeline, our studies are both short-term and long-term, and the interventions as well are short-term and long-term. So some of our interventions will be, one-time lump sum transfers. So they get all the cash at once. Other interventions will be universal basic income. So giving little amounts of money over a very long period of time. The longest one that we're doing right now in Kenya is over 12 years. And so as a sector, there's actually not much long-term studies out there in the entire aid sector. And of the ones that there are out there, 6 of them are in cash. And so all of which have shown positive results, and long-term here meaning 10 plus years. But we have results coming out this year as well on some of our longer-term studies that we'll also be excited to share on some of the long-term benefits in addition to just, their income went up that year, obviously, if they got a huge influx of cash. But we'll check in on some of our programs up to 12 years later.
Very cool, Elon. Now, working with that idea, right? I mean, obviously, one of the important things for GiveDirectly is to help people wrap their heads around the idea of giving cash without strings attached, right? And I think it's one thing for people to kind of embrace the idea that there are certain areas where there's not enough capital to help move the economy in a good direction. And so if a number of people living in poverty suddenly are able to participate in the economy effectively, then that's helping the entire community. Great. When you're thinking about, say, poor areas of the developed world, so, whether it's Appalachia or just areas of, say, the United States, have you tried these same programs in these kinds of settings as well? And do they show any difference with regard to effectiveness?
In terms of, are we working in places that are so poor or remote that the cash might not be as effective? Is that the question?
Actually, the opposite of that. So if, let's say that there's a part of, and I come back to Appalachia because we had an exceptional program about work to develop the economy there several years ago. So you can imagine like a small town in West Virginia, right? And
Sure.
the coal industry has died there. And so there are a lot of people who have a lot of needs for which a universal basic income structure might be quite useful. But maybe that involves a different set of concerns than in rural Kenya.
Yeah, totally. And funny you mentioned Kenya because we had actually a recent visit to Kenya from California local officials to go learn about interventions in the US by visiting some of our Kenya programs. And there's an interesting LA Times article about some of their learnings. But I'll speak to the US specifically because we also do work in the US. And most recently launched a program in Flint, Michigan, where we're giving $1,500 to every mom and newborn child in the entire city. And so I think a couple things about the US is, one, is it's more expensive to lift someone out of poverty in the US than it is in rural Malawi. $1,000 is not going to do it. But we have shown that the work there is incredibly effective. I think working with governments and local governments is super important as well. And we've worked with governments in Harris County, in Chicago, and Cook County. And so that's something we like to continue to see, both on the, giving more cash to people in need, but also on the policy side. The US has such a big hold on where foreign aid spending gets spent, and to see it happen in their own country is pretty impactful. And when we launched a massive COVID response in the US, we saw a lot of those donors even convert internationally. About 20% of our donors started to donate internationally after they saw the effect it had in local communities. And so I think you don't have the same stories or same means of what it looks like to live on less than $2.15 a day. But that's not to say that people aren't living in poverty in the US. And that's something we've wanted to address. And so started working both in guaranteed income programs, but also in responses to disasters. So like in Puerto Rico and Florida had a response there as well, and worked in Harvey as well. So yeah.
So along those lines, you talk about, I believe the term you used was these community meetings that allow, and I'm, I'm envisioning and I'm trying to avoid, a certain kind of paternalistic, kind of mind frame on this. But if what you have is a group of people meeting as a community, there's good news, obviously, in that there's an opportunity for a kind of a UBI approach. Great. But is there also work at that time for the community to commit together to making this work in some way? I assume that's not part of your structure. Well, I don't know that. Is that part of your structure? If so, how does it work? If not,
that's a great question.
That kind of thing.
It is not part of our structure, but it has unintentionally become part of our outcomes, I would say. And again, this is part of the sort of beauty of cash is we have no idea what folks are going to do with it. And we don't want to know. It's their cash to use. But we found many communities pooling together funds, to buy a water filtration system for their village or set up a shop for the community to all chip in and pay for. And so I think that we leave to the villages themselves. They know what they would want to use the money for, but there's no restrictions we put on for community-wide investments. But we have seen more recently people pooling together money from communities and local leaders being excited about folks wanting to come together to do so. But it is not part of our structure. We focus on the individuals or household level.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not entirely convinced that you don't want to know what they do with the money. I mean, that seems to be part of the data that makes the case for GiveDirectly, right? But all good. Speaking of the money, I mean, like one of the things you guys do on your website is you make it very easy to get to your Form 990s, the information that you report. Looks like over the last 2 years or the 2021, 2022 fiscal years anyway, you guys pulled in north of $400 million, right? And tell us a little bit about where that money comes from and how you're approaching getting not just perhaps small donors, but company corporate giving to buy into the idea that this is the most effective way to go, or this is an especially effective way to go.
Yeah, that's a good question. I see the same one in the chat here, so I'm happy to speak about the fundraising side. And I think it's been a bit of a journey that's changed since our founding to now. I think when we started, folks similarly in the Silicon Valley community were super excited about this new novel idea about cash. Really interesting to, just think about, well, why don't we just give cash to people? And this was this brand new idea that seemed crazy. And Silicon Valley people love that. And so we had a lot of early investors from really generous individuals, but also some really helpful corporate partnerships to get us off the ground. So Google, for example, has worked a lot with us. And we've got a bunch of others as well. We'll also work with, your more multilateral, bilateral organizations like USAID or the World Bank that can come in with bigger grants or funds as well. I think when you're fundraising from individuals, you have to also think about the economy. So when the economy was doing really well, individual fundraising was doing really well, particularly in Silicon Valley. When it was doing worse, you'll see less money coming in from folks in the tech industry. I think something that really speaks to GiveDirectly for folks is our sort of data-driven approach. And so a lot of folks in the quantitative analytics space, traders, hedge fund folks, really like that we do the RCTs, really like that we share our finances, that we post about our data, that we don't filter our stories. And so that attracted a lot of people pretty naturally. But I will say we're a pretty small team on the fundraising side. We care a lot about our efficiency of our programs. So a lot of organizations will talk about our efficiency. Ours is pretty simple. It's how much money is not going into the direct hands of people. And so for every staff we want to hire to help on fundraising, that's money you're taking away from people who need it much more. And so trying to figure out that balance is always, a point of tension when you have ambitious fundraising goals, but it's one we try to keep a recipient first mindset on.
Can you follow up on that a little bit? One of the most impressive arguments about effective philanthropy that I've ever heard, came from the person who started the what became the 3-day walk, the AIDS, so like, and they actually have a comparatively heavy overhead, but they were able to raise, many multiples in terms of cash for projects related to addressing AIDS and breast cancer. Is it that there is an environment that is so focused on overhead costs that becomes a part of the tension that you deal with in making decisions within the organization?
No, it's a good question. And I think with cash, something that's helpful with it is you limit so much of that overhead cost because you're not shipping materials or having excess marketing or running campaigns like doing a walk or something. The model is pretty simple of raise money from people, send it to someone on a phone. And so a lot of that comes pretty naturally of we don't have a lot of huge marketing campaigns. I think cash kind of sells itself to a lot of people. And I think if we want to continue to scale, yeah, you'll have that more of a balance if you have way more ambitious fundraising and you want year over year growth. But I think over the last decade, we've been able to grow pretty naturally, partly because, the stories of people are speaking for themselves. Cash is speaking for itself and the research is speaking for itself. And I think we just spend far less money on, big marketing campaigns or staffing costs but I think as you start to expand to different countries as well, also comes its different costs as well. You have to set up a brand new team, hire a country director for that country, et cetera. And so I think like any other company, you'll have growing pains as you think about scaling.
Well, a couple of final questions for you there then. One is you talked about giving phones with the money. I mean, obviously that becomes a non-cash thing, but this is something that has developed as a part of how you see doing what you do effectively. And I'm curious, even though you have what I would consider a somewhat aggressive, but understandably so, argument about where people are going to choose to donate. I'm guessing you've had some really good partnerships along the way as well, and see if is there something in that space that you'd like to speak to a bit before we finish the recording?
In terms of partnerships, I mean, when it comes to donating, and I'll start with a caveat of I think donating to other organizations is also incredibly useful. I'm a big cash advocate, but I think whether you're donating to climate, health interventions, those are still really respectful and great organizations. And so I do think on the partnership side, we have a whole range of partners from the mobile phone, like companies that we're working with. So telco providers in each of these countries can be different. So we wouldn't be able to do that work without them. We have partners who are sort of in the effective altruism space and folks pretty like-minded who think about effective giving and think about GiveDirectly as well. And then implementation partners like Google that we talked about that will help us actually do the work and help us spend the money. But we own the end-to-end delivery of the cash and hope to continue doing that because I think it's much easier to track how efficiently we're able to get the cash in the hands of recipients.
Good deal. All right. Well, we'll wind down the recording. Although one of the benefits that we always have of meeting these fantastically interesting people is that after we finish the recording, we keep getting to talk to them as long as their time allows, right? So before I hand it back to Elon for a final word, let me thank all of you who have watched this video. Thank you for taking your time. There is very much a perspective in our Rotary Club that the more we can get these kinds of stories of innovative service to others out in the world, the more people will say, I want to make something like that happen in my community, or I want to get involved in that in some way. And we welcome your connecting with us. There's a number of ways you can do it. You can find our club online at rotary.cool, COOL, really. And you can also look at rotary.org to learn about where there may be Rotary clubs in your communities. And we ask that you consider looking at that because there's something very special about regularly connecting with people who care about making the world a better place. And especially, from our perspective, doing it in especially sustainable and innovative ways. As we always like to do, we headed back to our speaker for the final word. So Elon, what would you like people to have clearly in mind as they finish watching the video?
Well, first, to say thanks for just having me here. But I will say for folks, as you think about all the different types of ways you can help, either with your time or your resources, if you're ever looking to address extreme poverty and address the sort of abiding shame of people not wanting to give cash, I think my answer is quite simple. Trust people in poverty with cash. And thank you again, everyone, for having me here. It's been a real treat.
Well, it was a pleasure to have you with us. And for all of you, we look forward to seeing you again next week.